And good evening, and welcome to the Woo Watch, Episode 2, Promises Made. And this is an episode that I already had planned, but after seeing some of the local media coverage over the last week, I realized it was a very important one. And that is, how exactly will we be judging a Woo administration? What were the promises made during the campaign? What can we expect her to try to accomplish? And what should we push her to do so? And before we get into all that, there are some updates from the week. Michelle Wu was sworn in as Boston. There's some debate over the actual numbering, but as Boston's next mayor this past Tuesday at, I believe, 12:34 p.m. And she quickly also announced some staffing positions. And these are people that you can consider being her close advisors. There's not yet to been made a key chief of staff, things like that. And I had some criticisms last week of some of Michelle's hires, and I felt a lot more positive after looking over this list because these are people who come from Wu's campaign. They're overwhelmingly Warren people. Sometimes that's a negative, sometimes that's a positive. And they are very much Michelle's team, not more just encompassing or absorbing a Menino or a Marty Walsh hire. And so I'm very much looking forward to what they do. One addition, who I do not believe was on the campaign, Mike Firestone. I know he comes from a wealthy family. He was the former chief of staff of Attorney General Maura Healey, which is not the greatest of signs. However, he was also the director of a group that is pushing back against the Proposition 22 style legislation. And so if that is what you've been focused on, then you're okay in my book, and you're starting off on the right foot. And his role will be the chief of policy and strategic planning. But just about everyone else, if you were following the campaign, you also probably follow them on Twitter. And so again, best of luck. And now there were two big announcements that Michelle made today, both definitely positive. However, one got me incredibly angry, but that was nothing that has to do with Michelle. The first one, and this is rapidly changing in terms of a developing story, but Wu issued a pause of the removal of people living on mass and cash. She put a pause to the violent sweeps that were going on under the former Janey administration. And it is my understanding that this pause was until a lawsuit, which was being discussed today by the ACLU against the city of Boston for this incrimination of people who have a simple lack of housing or who are currently facing issues of mental health or abuse. And then I thought I saw maybe an hour or two ago that this is going to be ongoing, that actually by Michelle pausing it, it made almost the lawsuit moot. And so I really don't know what the ending result is of what happened today. All I do know is that Michelle issued a pause, and that is, to be honest, more than I thought she would do on day one. I thought her administration would kind of just wait to see what happens with this lawsuit. But that was encouraging to see. So she definitely deserves points on that. But secondary, and I just realized I'm not showing you my fun visuals. Bam. The second thing she did was regarding expanding free public transportation here. And she wanted the Boston City Council to direct $8 million in federal aid to eliminate bus fares on 3 different routes over the next 2 years as part of a small pilot program. You recall that there's already one bus route that is free here in the city that got an extension because of how successful it was in increasing ridership, of how much people enjoyed it, and it came in under budget. And so that was already going to be extended. And then Michelle wanted to extend an additional 2 routes. And that previous bus was Route 28. And then what Michelle proposed and sent the directive to the city council to do earlier today was starting in January to provide fare-free service on routes 23 and 29. Let's see if we can get a sense. So 28 goes from Blue Hill Avenue, from Mattapan, crossing into Nubian Square and Roxbury. The 23rd goes to Ashmont Station in Dorchester through Grove Hall, the Ruggles Station. 29, Mattapan Square, Jackson Square. So this is predominantly areas with people of color, predominantly people who rely on public transportation, who this would have made an incredible difference. And now I'm starting to use past tense of would have. Because what I then found out after Michelle sent this to the Boston City Council, that Andrea Campbell, using a legislative move, prevented a vote on this bill. And her reason for doing so was none other out of pure spite. It was 100% because she did not want Michelle to have a victory on day one, period. The district that she is still a representative of, District 4, I believe her constituents would have benefited the most in this area. And by delaying it, I don't care if this delays it 2 months or 2 weeks or 2 seconds. The idea that she would delay something which would provide a material benefit for the poorest citizens of Boston should be met with nothing short of outrage and disgust and anger. And I went off mentally for about an hour, 2 hours after I found this out. I think the next steps is now it goes to a committee and they have to re-vote on it. Michael Flaherty was even pushing her on this, saying, are you sure you want to stop us from having a vote on this? It's a pilot program. It's basically free money from the federal government. Everyone who ran for office was on board of increasing free bus transportation. It is not a controversial element. We already have a pilot program doing this. Andrea Campbell doesn't even vote no, killed the vote on it. Again, for nothing more out of spite. And I don't know what her next move is, but for her to do that is still, it's shocking and it's depressing, and everyone should feel outraged by it. But I am hoping maybe a silver lining is that Wu's team should take this and instantly learn a lesson from it. That one of the greatest strengths of Michelle, her ability to use interpersonal relationships, is not going to be enough to make larger change in this city. If we can't even get a pilot program approved through the Boston City Council. And the second is that we can never rely on people doing what is in the best interest of their constituents. They will be petty, they will be vindictive. And so I hope the team takes this as a lesson, that they use it. I want to buy all of them a baseball bat that they can keep in their offices that just says swing away, so that they know the level of intensity that they're going to need to do to make even small incremental changes like a pilot program. But we'll see what comes about. And that's not the main focus of today's episode. As I said before, we're going to look back on what Michelle promised. And before I do that, I'll give my usual disclaimer to the lovely crew on TikTok. If you want to follow me on Twitch, that way you can have more eye contact and you can see the articles that I bring up. But again, do what you will. I'm just going to read a couple of comments that I see. Nopti asks, any thoughts on the Boston's Museum of Fine Arts strike? I saw the headline. To be honest, I haven't read up that much about it. I'm hoping I see more coverage of it so I can learn more about it. I instinctively am going to support any sort of a strike. I don't know what the actual grievances are, but I definitely need to read up on it. Auntie Lydia, hi Boston, woke supremacists, leftists, and liberals are deranged and evil. Have a nice evening. Okay, I didn't really understand that one. I am too... Kate the Great says, I'm too old for Twitch. That's okay. Janu 2 says, hello. Mascrass asks, that's the city council, petty and soaked in favoritism. Absolutely true. Do I like hummus? Yes, I do like hummus. But okay, so there are 4 main policy, I don't know what to call them, avenues that I said a year ago that I would be using as criteria to judge the policies based off of whoever be running for mayor. Those were police, housing, climate change, and transportation. Those are the big 4 that I laid out. And something that I started to see early this week, I heard it on a radio program here in Boston. I started to see articles about it, and I think this article encompasses it, from Anthony Brooks, November 16th, so just yesterday, WBUR. The title is, Michelle Wu has big plans for Boston. She'll need help to get things done. She campaigned on an ambitious progressive agenda promising universal pre-K education, affordable childcare, free public transportation, and a Green New Deal. Now comes the hard part, running the city and turning her campaign promises into reality. Now, Michelle Wu never promised the majority of what was just stated. Michelle Wu never said, in my first term, we will have free public transportation here in the city. I'm sure he mentions it later on. Michelle Wu never said, in my first term, we will lift the ban on rent control and we will have rent control in this city by year 3. She always articulated that those are much larger visions for the city. And so it is vital that we actually find criteria that we will be able to judge a Wu administration on. And we're going to figure those out by looking at her campaign page, my own background of things that she promised, and a questionnaires that she filled out so that we know what those benchmarks are. And we're going to start with the police, because this is something that there is a very, very low barrier to what people expect, and it's going to be fought incredibly intensely by the Boston Police Department. And so on the issue of police, and just today, the editorial board of the Globe, even they are on the side of some of these changes, and there's going to be some outlines that we can expect. Now, what Michelle wrote, and the reason I was a little bit late on that broadcast today was because I had some tech issues, and now I have to go back and find kind of somewhat of the key sections. But anything about restructuring the culture, changing the structure of the Boston Police Department is a fool's errand, that is not where the actual power lies. The actual power lies in how much material resources are we going to give the Boston Police Department. We will probably have a budget of close to $4 billion next year. Every dollar that goes to the police is now another dollar that's not going somewhere else. And so you will not be able to change the culture. Moving around the structure doesn't do it. This is a battle over resources. That's what politics is. And that is why the biggest thing, and there are some others, but she has it listed here, reducing wasteful overtime spending to reinvest those funds in neighborhood level services. Now, all in 2020, on a different program I was on, Renters Radio, when we had that big budget fight, I kept articulating that they need to not focus on overtime budget and instead focus on the total budget, because the overtime budget is amorphous. They are allowed to, because of their contract with the city, go over it. And they have repeatedly gone over it basically every year. In 2020, they went over it by an additional $12 million. This past year, the most recent data I had was in May, and they were already projected to be well over budget after trying to do a symbolic cut. So you cannot take it from the overtime. Now, something Michelle wants to do is going to be about the police contract. And this is what we heard about for the last 2 years. Oh, you can't, no, it's all because of the contract. We can't do anything. It's all because of the contract. Well, the Boston Police Department's contract expired with the city June 30th of 2020. They have still not renegotiated another one. And the reason for that is, if anyone remembers what was happening on June 30th in 2020, we were having daily protests in the streets of Boston, in the streets of every major city in the country. So that terrain to have a debate over the new contract is not going to be favorable to the police. So the police wanted to delay. The police wanted to wait, and they had Marty Walsh, who was more on the side of the police than just about any other organization, maybe second to labor unions, construction in particular. So they have delayed this, waiting for a more favorable ground to renegotiate their contract to get even more money, incentives, more of the blue shield so that they handle their investigations. But now we have a new administration. And maybe they were also hoping, hey, who knows, maybe Anissa will get in, she'll cut us a fair deal. They have Michelle. And we're going to talk more about what I think Michelle and her team should do during these negotiations. But let's look at some more of her direct questions and policy goals for the Boston Police. And again, I had all these tabs set up, and I had to restart the computer. I don't know, y'all don't want to hear this stuff, but bear with me while I scroll and find it. Should be F. Okay, public safety. And this is a questionnaire filled out by Progressive Mass. I am using them for two different reasons. One is because they had questionnaires of all of the candidates, and we're going to take a look at their questionnaires for the Boston City Council when I do what will be my first segment of a different series looking through the Boston City Council, which again, I need help on the title with. Right now, the only title I can think of is Council Curious, and that's a horrible title. So it needs to, someone help me think of I like the Woo Watch. Maybe it has to be alliteration, maybe it doesn't. But anyway. Oh, and the second reason we're going to be using Progressive Mass is I know it was helped, this questionnaire was probably largely shaped by Jonathan Cohn, who, if anyone does any sort of activism in Boston, knows who he is. He's well respected between everyone, moderate, liberal, progressive, socialist. And so I trust him setting this up and how they ended up doing the structuring. So for those two reasons, we're going to go with it. All right. So here are some of the basic questions. Do you support the Suffolk County DA do not prosecute list? Michelle says yes. Do you support ending information sharing with the Boston Police and ICE? Also yes. Support ending the Boston Police Gang database? Yes. Again, these are all things that I think more or less 6-7 members of the council will as well. So now we get into some of the things that will come about during the contract negotiation, because that is where Michelle is going to have a lot of the power. Would you support a hard cap on overtime for individual officers? She says yes. And this will be one of the biggest things. I'm going to read what she wrote. In this case, the data reveals significant overtime costs for hours not worked to policies such as the 4-hour minimum court appearance policy, and an increasing average overtime as a percentage of salary with more senior rank. Basically, because of how their contract is written, if they show up to a court date and it's 15 minutes, they get to bill the city for 4 hours. And I think is close to like $100 an hour. And so, because we have no caps on this, they can basically charge it limitless. Let's not forget that there was also a massive scandal in terms of them forging overtime over the past. I mean, I'm sure they've been doing it forever. I think the scandal broke maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And continuing, what changes to the 2017? That was when they first negotiated this new contract. What changes to the 2017 Boston Police Patrolmen's Association contract would you advocate for? So the next contract must include provisions for transparency and public accountability. Those are more or less blank terms. Continuing, enables the sharing of data with the public on officers' use of force and misconduct. Okay, here's a good one. We must also end the practice of mandatory arbitration, which has overturned 72% of BPD disciplinary actions. So what happened, and I think this is all the way back in 2007, and you see this a lot, is that the Boston Police was able to negotiate that we are not going to have third-party arbitration, which basically would mean that a different agency will investigate if a police officer does something wrong. Instead, no, the police will investigate themselves. And anyone with common sense or half a brain who has been paying attention realizes how much of a failed system that is. We had an officer who allegedly was a known pedophile, protected, accelerated through the ranks, and was elected to be the head of the Boston Police Union. That can only happen in a closed system where you're allowing police to investigate themselves. And so maybe now we're getting into what are the fixed things that Michelle is saying she wants to do that we should hold her accountable for. That's a big one. As part of the new contract negotiation, you need to allow third-party arbitration in any cases of abuse or police violence or anything like that. The second, and we already hit on a little bit, is a firm cap on overtime. Now, I don't think that's going to be enough in terms of reallocating resources to the Boston, to communities, to investments that will help reduce crime. Because if we do pass a cap on overtime, it could maybe have prevented $5 million that they otherwise would have went over, $10 million. That is an incredibly small when we're talking, again, about a $4 billion budget, when we're talking about a department which has close to a $470 million a year allowance. Substantive cuts, I want 40 to 50 million cut from that department going towards services that we know will actually help reduce crime. However, Michelle is saying she will put a hard cap on overtime. So by her own words, you can judge her on that. However, that to me is not good enough, and we should always be pushing her a little bit more. Finally, and she probably gets to a little bit later, is ending the monopolies that the police department has on details. Whenever there's construction going on in the city, you see the police officer wearing the little vest directing traffic. There is no reason that you cannot allow municipal workers, you cannot have training for people to do that. Police officers themselves will tell you that they receive zero training to do it. Most people could figure it out in about 2 minutes how to direct traffic. And right now the police have a monopoly over they get to do that, no one else. And this results in them again increasing their salaries, increasing the chance of some sort of an escalation. There's no reason you need a gun to pause a car and wave another one, have a vest. People just respect the vest. And second, it would open up well-paying jobs to people in the community. And third, a lot of the open positions for details do not get filled, which means construction workers are at risk because a police officer does not sign up for the detail. They have a monopoly over who gets to do it, so it doesn't just go to a second party that says, oh, hey, yeah, we have workers working the night shift. We need someone to make sure that they're safe. So this would help improve worker safety, good paying jobs in the community, lowers the risk of someone getting shot unnecessarily. Now, on all of those, let's see, was there another one for this? If you're watching me live, this is the actual police contract. Again, expired June 30th, 2020. It's 80 pages. I wouldn't mind going through it myself. But what I imagine is going to happen is, because the police have been operating without a new contract for about a year and a half now, and I think they're going to look at Michelle and they're going to say, Michelle is a pushover. That this is someone that we can intimidate, that we can dominate, that we are not going to budge an inch. And even if it's a small cap on OT, so you can't just do unlimited amounts, you can only do somewhat of an unlimited amount, they will fight that with the same intensity as saying Michelle wants to abolish the police. Any little marginal thing that Michelle does to try to cut back on programs or whatever, services or finances that they already get, any rollback on anything will be fought with the same intensity as if it's me sitting across the table with them saying that we need to defund the police. And because of that, what I think is going to happen is they will start to leak the strike word. And what I am hoping, praying, is that right now, as part of Wu's new team, they have someone who you put them in a little room with Google and a chalkboard, and you say, I want you to look up every police strike in the last 30 years. What were the tactics used? What was their messaging? How successful were they? What counter messaging worked against it? Because if I was the Boston Police Department, looking at what the terrain is, looking at how they feel under attack and underappreciated, looking at who I believe that they view Michelle as, I think they're going to threaten to strike if they don't get not just no rollbacks, but an expansion of what they want. And I think that's going to be the level of intensity that we're going to see them use, because they feel that they're on their back foot. How real that is, I don't know. But we'll see early, because they will probably end up coming up to with a new contract within her first term. Is Michelle going to keep these promises? Which, again, just to outline them, hard cap on OT, ending the monopoly on details, third-party arbitration, which even with that, I'm not completely satisfied, because we need to be doing more than slight limits on OT. We need to be making significant cuts. Or will she backtrack on it? So those are the fair assessments of how to judge a Wu administration when it comes to police. All right, I see some questions building before we get to the fun stuff. Somebody is commenting on rent control. It's failed. We're going to talk about rent control for a second, but no, it hasn't. The woo-hoo. Judo is Jonathan is a pseudo politician himself. I respect him, but I don't trust him. Okay, fair enough. Question, do you see Wu and Anissa working on bills they somewhat agree on? Well, Anissa is no longer going to be on the city council come January, so I have no idea what her next steps are. I'm sure she'll be running for something else soon. Put cameras on them and ticketing powers. I think referring to the police? But okay. Now let's get to a fun one, which is housing. Because this is probably the one that I know the most about, that I think will be the fairest to judge her on, that I think will probably have the most consequences in terms of the life of the city. And now let's take a look. Michelle has a lot of policies from her page here. And so rather than actually reading through those, hold on, I didn't bring it up. Oh, I'm going to cheat. All right. Housing. There are, 3 or 4 main criteria that I think we can judge the Wu administration is she successful in housing? And we're going to save the fun one, the abolition of the BPDA, for the end. So, first question, or second, whatever. What opportunities do you see for leveraging city-owned or expanding affordable housing? Reading Michelle's answer. Boston can set up preferences for community land trusts and public land disposition processes, ensuring permanent affordability. That's a lot of words, but promoting community land trusts I'm in favor of. We can also redevelop municipal buildings into mixed-use developments. We could also expand the Boston Housing Authority's portfolio through scattered site ownership, acquiring vacant parcels or distressed units for affordable housing. So the idea of expanding public-owned land is absolutely the benchmark. The more land that is owned by the city, the better we are where it comes to housing prices. Because if it is not owned by the city, then it's owned privately. And if it's owned privately, then it is purely a commodity, which only matters its property value and how much value does it give to the person who owns it. And so any advancement in changing that dynamic, every piece of land acquired through the city is a positive. I like the E word, eminent domain. I think that needs to be a tool that is used a hell of a lot more. We have to provide market rate. That's okay. We'll do it. Acquire public land. So Michelle is calling for that. So am I. Whatever she ends up acquiring, I'm going to say they should have doubled it, but let's see what they end up doing. But we absolutely should push for more city-owned land. Do you support increasing the real estate transfer tax? Of course she does. Whenever there's a sale of one large commercial property to another, taking a couple extra bucks for the city. Again, most people support that. Rent control. Do you support rent control? Michelle being the only candidate that says yes. To stem Boston's displacement crisis, we need to stabilize rents in the short term while increasing the supply of affordable housing. Right now, state legislation prevents Boston, so on and so forth. So, and this is the big thing. So, Michelle Wu is saying she supports rent control. She never promised that she will achieve rent control in her first term or anything like that. But if she is serious about rent control, if she is serious about getting that done, it will have to go through the State House. And what she can do, because again, her greatest strength is the interpersonal relationships, the building of one-on-ones. That is not going to be enough in the Massachusetts State House. We have a lot of Massachusetts state representatives that are absolutely horrible who represent areas of Boston that overwhelmingly voted for Michelle. And so 2022, during the next State House election cycle, I want Michelle to have one-on-ones, and I know she will, with all of those representatives and saying, my two big policies that I need buy-in at the State House are free public transportation and rent control. Do you support those two things, yes or no? And if she gets any pushback, and this is how you start to use power, you say, okay, my next meeting is with your primary challenger. And I really want to see Michelle make strong endorsements during the primaries for next year's election, especially if it is against Massachusetts state representatives, the state Senate representatives who represent this area who do not share those two policy goals. I'm talking Daniel Hunt. I'm talking Nick Collins. There's plenty of them. She needs to use her power as one of the largest vote getters, one of the biggest blowout elections in Boston's history, to actually throw that weight around and use that power. So if she is serious about rent control, we better be seeing some endorsements or some current lawmakers changing their vote, changing their support. Now, the next is about IDP policy. So IDP, inclusionary development policy, basically, maybe they get it here. Boston's inclusionary development policy requires that 13% of the units in a building need to be quote-unquote affordable. And now I've talked ad nauseum about this, but basically, when they say affordable, that doesn't mean what you think it means. It uses a measurement from HUD, the Housing of Urban Development at the federal level. They view affordable as part of an area median income, which encompasses over 100 cities and towns, some of which aren't even in Massachusetts. And they come to a figure close to, it makes the math easy, $100,000 a year. The actual median area income of some parts of Boston are closer to $35,000, $38,000 a year. So their affordable units are based upon a measurement which is 2 to 3 times what the actual person makes. And currently, you need to have 13% if you're going to build something 10 or more units. Everyone with me so far with math? Finding it. However, there were two recent things that changed for Boston law around zoning. One of which was involving this IDP policy. So I'm reading now from the city's website. The new law will allow the Boston to codify its inclusionary development policy into the Boston zoning code. Whenever you hear zoning code, it just means the rules around building. And basically, it now gives the power, I believe, to the BPDA to change that measurement so that it doesn't have to be 13%. But I do not know if this is a power that the city council gets to ultimately decide, if it is completely up to the BPDA to create this new measurement, but we have it passed that we get to change this. So this 13% number gets to change. And in Michelle's questionnaire, I think she said, quoting now, yes, I support increasing this to at least 20%. Now, if anyone has ever entered into a negotiation can tell you, you never tell someone your floor. You start with about double your ceiling. It's kind of like going into, I don't know, a used car dealership and telling them, well, I got 20 grand on me, but I really want to come under that. If they know that that's the number in your head, guess what? You're going to end up spending 20 grand for a car. And in this, if you tell developers, well, I want at least 20, yeah, they're going to say, that's all you're getting. Because we already knew, or know, from the Suffolk Downs development, the absolute monstrosity, which is passed in East Boston, bought by a Texas billionaire, who I think is my age, they were okay with 20%. So now we know that they are hoping 20%, that they still see hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in profits at 20%. Now, there's a coalition called the Coalition for a Truly Affordable Boston, of which I am a member through a housing organization that I work with, and they are calling for 33%, not at the HUD levels of $100,000 a year, $90,000 a year, $80,000 a year, but at truly affordable levels. So we're talking 30% AMI, 40% AMI, 50% AMI, which again, roughly translates to about 30, 40, 50 grand a year. And if you're watching on Twitch, which again, I encourage you all from my little TikTok to do, you see a nice graphic of how much do Boston residents actually make versus how much housing are we actually providing. And shocker, a lot of the new housing we have is around luxury units. So this coalition, they want 1/3 truly affordable. Again, if that's what we want, we start the negotiation at 60% truly affordable. Another 20% at affordable. And now you can have your 20% of your market rate value. Because all of housing, this whole IDP policy, it is a split between how much profit is the developer and the owner is going to make versus what concessions did the city get. For every unit of housing that we take out of market rate and we put it into an affordable level column, that is a loss of profit for the developer and the owners. And so they fight that with tooth and nail. And they get to hide how much profit they're anticipating on getting, which is why I really want a lot more transparency. And if I was in charge or responsible, I would have my own little team of consultants that say, we estimate that you are going to make this much money in profit. That is unacceptable because this is going to cause gentrification, displacement, pain, increased rents for the residents of the city, and you're not going to pocket that cash. So we will allow you to make 6% return on investment, 5%, 7%. But this doubling your growth every 10 years that you saw over the past decade is not happening anymore. And we're going to use our numbers, not yours. But Michelle was saying she wants to increase the IDP policy. I really want, it's already a power that we have, but it needs to be a lot more than 20%. The other recent thing that passed, I'm looking at an article from December 9th, 2020. basically has a new policy. This is also through the BPDA, and we'll get into the fun one in a second, so everyone hold on, which requires, in addition to a new affirmatively furthering fair housing assessment, which is guided by a displacement analysis and historical exclusion data that will be provided by the BPDA. So for any new development which is supposed to come about, the BPDA is supposed to produce a document similar to an EPA study, Environmental Protection Agency. What are the environmental impacts of this development? They are supposed to provide a study which shows what is going to be the gentrification and displacement because of this. Now, for a lot of reasons, which we'll talk about in the BPDA segment, I don't trust them at all to do this assessment. I haven't even seen one yet, so I don't even know if they're doing it. But it is another measurement that we can use to stop the type of luxury development. And so I am hoping that that is used with a lot more intensity, that we don't just trust their numbers. And so, again, to backtrack, is it fair to say that Michelle Wu will bring about rent control in her first term? No, and she never promised to. How can we measure if she's serious about rent control? How much is she actually weighing in on the 2022 elections? That's going to be a big measurement. She says IDP policy to 20%. That's not good enough. Increasing city-owned land. Let's see how much she does it. And let's see if she uses the gentrification study. But finally, the fun one is the BPDA. Michelle, maybe about 2 years ago, created a great document called How and Why to Abolish the BPDA. And to summarize quickly, the BPDA is a quasi-public, quasi-private agency that controls property throughout Boston, which charges rents on that property. That's how they have their revenue, and they are really in charge of what gets built and what doesn't. There's also a zoning board administration. Just put that to the side for now. And there is no large vision, even though there's something I think called the Boston Vision 2030. There is no plan for how we do development in this city, to cut to the chase. Everything is just sporadic parcels. And because this agency is fully self-funded from the property rents that they acquire, it is only within their interest to increase the property value of what is happening. And whenever you have an agency which has its own internal revenue stream, it means then that it is completely cut off and disconnected from democratic accountability. Because in theory, the people who run this are appointed by the mayor and the governor. And of course, the governor is going to put a lot more private property-centered focused people than public. And same with Marty. But because they have their own separate revenue, they don't have to listen. They're in. They are completely detached from Boston City Council. They don't need to crawl to a democratically elected lawmaker for a budget. And this is what you saw in New York City in the big lesson from Robert Moses, who I'm sure many of you have heard about before. He is a historic, you can't call him a developer, a bureaucrat from New York City, which basically gutted Manhattan, removed poor communities of color, and turned it into the highway, super fun, luxury playground of the rich that it is today. That was all done because he had many positions, but he was detached and had his own revenue stream. And this is something that Michelle in this document identifies as being one of the biggest problems, which is very optimistic that she's also able to see that. And of course, she's brilliant, so she should. So I'm going to read to you some segments. Boston's residents must take back control of their future and institute a democratic system of planning and development that says a vision determined by the people, not developers driven by profit. Scanning. To realize this vision for a more equitable and sustainable system for planning and development in Boston, the anachronistic BPDA must be abolished, and its specific functions should be brought back under the control of city agencies and leaders directly accountable to the public. 100%. All right, here's her three-step plan to do this. Process 1, restore city control. Although state law delegates the planning board powers to the BPDA board, and would therefore require state legislation to undo it, the rest of the BPDA's powers are derived from the authorities granted by the mayor and the board. These authorities can be shifted back to Democratic control prior to any state action. That's obviously key. So now what will happen? What will happen to the employees? The BPDA is overseen by a 5-member board. We discussed that. They're paid a stipend of $10,000 a year. A lot of them get caught pocketing cash on the side, but that's a separate matter. And the proposed changes are the BPDA employees would simply become employees of the city of Boston, because if we're going to create a whole new organization to manage planning in the city, we're going to need people who know how to do that. And so rather than going from this opaque private to public agency, we're just going to transfer you over. It's called a just transition. It's the same thing that we're talking about with the Green New Deal legislation. The city could also take on employees by the local development corporation to staff all these new positions, and they will help run it. And again, in this document and on her website, she is very vocal about abolishing the BPDA, and their contract is up with the city, I believe, in 2022. So we are going to see this fight happen in her first term. And she published this document, when was it? October 19th for version number 1. So this is something that she has committed to for 2 years now, before she even announced that she'd be running for mayor. And this, to me, is something that she needs to be held to. Because now that she is the mayor, now that the buck stops with her and all that corny stuff, she is going to be under more pressure than she ever has before. Because most of Boston's tax revenue comes from property value. I think it's 74%. I'll look it up later. I think I'm close though. And this is the problem that all cities have, is that if your revenue comes from the property value, property taxes, well, then you also have a financial incentive to maintain property value as high as you can, because that's how you get money to do things. However, by doing so, you are kicking out the very people that you want to raise money for to create policies and programs to benefit. And she will start to feel that pressure. And that is why a lot of people, they get that voice whispered in their ear saying, oh, but no, let this luxury building, because then you can tax it and you'll use those taxes to help the policies. And they don't tell you that final part that I'm telling you, that the people that you're saying you're going to help are going to be displaced and gone. So for housing, again in summary, I wanted the destruction of this agency. She said it. This to me is a very clear benchmark that we can hold her accountable to. I want a real IDP policy in the city. I want a lot more transparency over how much profit these developers are making. I want a separate agency to be able to calculate those funds. I want a separate agency to create the gentrification study, because for now, as long as the BPDA is there, I don't trust their numbers. I want increased city-owned land, and I want to see her making some strong endorsements in 2022. I think those are all fair measurements of how to judge a successful Wu administration where it comes to housing. And now, finally, and going a little bit long, and I started late, is around, I don't know if I brought the tabs up, I'll wing it, climate and transportation. So I would like to have, I probably will in the future, have someone on who's a lot more knowledgeable than me in terms of what are the limits, what are the benchmarks that we should be using for a Wu administration where it comes to her housing plan. Where it comes to climate change and resiliency. But in terms of the T, and again, we saw earlier today, the expanding of free bus services as part of a pilot program. That's what I anticipate seeing a lot more of. That is an okay step, but I'm done with pilot programs. We need to be moving rapidly on this. I know a lot of people are saying we're going to see more expanded bus lanes, 100% support. That is absolutely going to be used as a measurement to judge this administration. I want to see increased bike lanes. That'll be another 100%. But where it comes to, again, pushing the State House around universal free public transportation, I want to see those endorsements, similar to what I said for housing. But We have tried, and we used to have, I think in the 1940s, we had late night 24/7 service here in Boston for public transportation. The idea that we have moved backwards, that with 80 years of technology and progress, we are moving backwards, is absolutely ridiculous. Marty Walsh took a crack at this multiple times, but because he doesn't care about public transportation and they were able to scare him, they always stopped it. I want to see a return to late night service for the MBTA. I want to see continued expansion of free bus services throughout the city. And I want to see, starting with 1 day a week, Sundays, MBTA is free. Free T. We're going to let's start with 1 day. You get to park for free on Sundays. We get to ride for free on Sundays. And then I want to see that expanded to the weekend. And then from that point, because there are some ways that we can fund this, but it would require changes to our tax code. And I believe, like many things, we need to go through the State House for that, which is why, again, I really think Michelle using her power as such a strong vote getter in 2022 to leverage those endorsements is going to be important. And in terms of some more climate things, and I haven't read this anywhere, at least in terms of Wu's doctrine, so this is what I want to push her towards, is that we really should have a moratorium on any coastal construction. I'm going to say 500 yards from a high tide mark. That might be too much, that might be too little. But everyone knows that we are going to experience massive sea level rise. We already are experiencing flooding if it rains too much. We're already experiencing flooding if there's a high tide with a good wind. That is going to increase. That is not a guess, that is a certainty. That is just an absolute fact. And we need to start using our coastal shores to build up resiliency. We cannot just keep adding pavement. We cannot just keep building with concrete along our coastal shores. We cannot keep allowing the seaport to just have a bunch of glass towers in a flood zone. And so I want a moratorium on all development along Boston's shoreline. Let's bring in the best people who can tell us, what do we need? Do we need a biodiverse land? And we might take some hit on housing. I think we need to get creative with the housing that we do build in these areas. I would love to see some sort of a transitional housing, things that are not meant to last for decades, because we know the land that they're going to be built on will not be there for decades. Because the term coastal retreat, if you haven't heard it yet, you're hearing it now. That is what they are going to be saying for decades. For the rest of your life, you will hear the phrase coastal retreat. And that'll mean we got to get the hell back because it's too much water for us to stay here. And the only way to delay that is to actually start using our coastal shoreline to increase protection. And I would love to find some people who can speak to that with more clarity and to use some examples, not having to always go to Norway and Scandinavia, because I know they've done this. And I know other places all over the world are doing this. I want to find some examples here in this country, and if we can't, let's go abroad. If we're going to be facing challenges that no one's ever faced before, we have to get as creative as no one's ever been before. So Wu ran on big ideas. There are some clear and fair benchmarks that we discussed earlier to hold her accountable to. But it's time to get creative. It's time to get tough. And I hope her and her team are ready. Because if Andrea's actions today didn't make it clear, you don't have a lot of friends who want you to succeed. There's a lot of people, including in the media, that want to just have a nice lazy story for the next 2 years about how progressives can't get anything done because they met with reality. This is why you need incremental change, because their readers lap that up. But we need you to succeed. And so with that, I'm going to say goodnight. Welcome to episode 2. We'll see what happens next week. I might start doing the council series, because we need to start learning who those players are going to be, what coalitions are forming, what's going on with the council presidency. So I heard something today, which, whew, but we'll get to that. But who knows? Maybe we'll do another episode of the Wu Watch. We'll see. And with that, my podcast people, I'm going to bid you adieu and good night. The Twitch, Facebook,